Vietnam was a just cause. It was a winnable war. It was unfortunate that we lost, and the ramifications of that defeat have echoed far beyond the importance of Vietnam per se. Of course, we did ultimately prevail in the Cold War and defeat communism, but it's still going in China, it's still in North Korea, it's still in Vietnam for that matter. It's not like these conflicts are really over, they're just entering new phases.
America's war in Vietnam comes to an end. POWs come home, and veterans deal with the personal price of their service. In Vietnam itself, the final collapse of Saigon leads to devastating consequences throughout Southeast Asia.
History did not end when the Cold War ended. We're in a more dangerous part of history now, and there's lessons that we need to remember, such as what happened in Vietnam when America pulled out.
Hello, I'm Brett Baer. As we've seen throughout this series, the war in Vietnam was full of miscalculation, mistakes, and missed opportunities. But by 1972, the service and sacrifice of so many brave Americans looked to be paying off. U.S. soldiers were coming home, and the peace that had eluded every president since Eisenhower appeared at hand. For the Vietnamese people, however, the most tragic events were yet to come.
The truth of the matter is that the Paris peace talks, hailed as a major breakthrough in 1968, have by 1972 achieved nothing. The delegates still turn up, make accusatory speeches, and leave. But it's all become nothing more than a puppet show without an audience, and there's nothing to comment on anymore. Everything that could be said in public has been said. And in the meantime, the war goes on and the casualty lists mount.
In 1972, the official peace talks in Paris may have seemed stalled, but behind the scenes, Henry Kissinger was conducting secret negotiations with key members of the North Vietnamese delegation. The terms proposed by Kissinger reflected the Nixon administration's growing frustration with the war and omitted key concessions demanded by the government of President Nguyen Van Thu in Saigon.
So at the end of 1972, Nixon is trying to get Thieu to sign off on a peace agreement, but this agreement involves leaving North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam in areas they already occupy, and Thieu does not think that is a viable option. He just doesn't want to leave them there indefinitely if America is going to leave.
Kissinger's proposal promised that Washington would withdraw all its troops from Vietnam. In exchange, Hanoi would return all captured American prisoners of war. But there was no mention of North Vietnam removing its forces from the South. Hanoi would be allowed to keep more than 150,000 troops in South Vietnam and an additional 100,000 in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. In a private White House conversation, Kissinger told Nixon that Thieu was right to be concerned.
I actually think we can settle on terms, however very high, but not Jews, on close to our terms. But, and I also think that Thieu is right, that our terms will eventually destroy.
But Nixon made a promise to the South Vietnamese leader.
Eventually, Nixon says, well, we're going to go out anyway with these terms, but I will return, help you out if there's another big violation, as in where you need massive U.S. air power. Thieu kind of reluctantly goes along with that.
I'm not a fan of the Paris Peace Accords. I believe you can argue that they should have been tougher, and that sort of leaving a North Vietnamese presence in the South was not appropriate and was very dangerous. Maybe that was the best that could be done at the time. The important point to take away from the Accords is that they had a legal guarantee that neither South Vietnam or North Vietnam would attack the other country.
At 12:30 Paris time today, January 23, 1973, the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam was initialed by Dr. Henry Kissinger on behalf of the United States and Special Advisor Lee Duc Tho on behalf of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam.
The fighting starts to pick back up, and both sides are trying to grab land from each other, expecting that there will be resumption of hostilities.
To the people and government of South Vietnam, by your courage, by your sacrifice, you have won the precious right to determine your own future. And you have developed the strength to defend that right. We look forward to working with you in the future, friends in peace, as we have been allies in war.
America did get its POWs back, or at least the ones on the Pentagon's official list. On May 24th, Nixon hosted a White House dinner in honor of the returned American prisoners of war.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you please be seated, and in a moment you will stand again.
Among those sharing the stage with the Nixons were Bob Hope, Sammy Davis Jr., Irving Berlin, and John Wayne.
You're the best we have, and I'll ride off into the sunset with you anytime.
It was the largest White House dinner in history. 590 POWs were in attendance. 34 couldn't make it due to injuries or trauma suffered during their time in captivity.
All of us would like to join in a round of applause for the brave men that took those B-52s in and did the job.
For Americans, the withdrawal of U.S. troops and the return of American POWs closed one chapter in the Vietnam conflict. But it did not end the war, as both sides quickly resumed fighting.
The peace talks, per se, were fine. The problem was the United States did not meet its commitments under the Paris Accords. We were supposed to keep supporting South Vietnam. The North, of course, broke the peace accords. Who would expect otherwise? They're communists, that's what they do.
The American withdrawal was hasty. Much of the infrastructure that America had built in South Vietnam was left intact, a decision that would come back to haunt the U.S.
When the Americans pulled out of South Vietnam, they left Cam Ranh Bay intact, which was significant because it was one of our largest naval bases in the entire world. Not even a single piece of plywood board was disrupted or destroyed. And it was left in place for the Russian Navy to come in and take over. So strategically, it was a huge, huge mistake.
Both the North and South Vietnamese armies continued to try to gain and hold territory. Some 25,000 Southern soldiers were killed in action in 1973, making it one of the bloodiest years for the Southern Army. Far from offering the help Nixon promised, the U.S. Congress turned its back on the South Vietnamese government. Just 6 months after the signing of the peace agreement, Congress banned any further military action in Southeast Asia, effectively abrogating key parts of the Paris Accords.
Cooper Church Amendment in 1973 was a congressional amendment that forbade any use of United States forces directly engaged in combat in Vietnam after 1973. And so during a period in which, after the Paris Accords, we were getting a massive North Vietnamese buildup, with huge Soviet assistance to the north, building up an incredible tank army to invade the South. In that period of time, all we needed to have basically kept South Vietnam an independent nation was American air power.
Congress intervened and said, we're going to make it illegal for the president to use U.S. forces in combat operations in the air, on the land, or off the shores of North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laos, or Cambodia. Ergo, well, at that point, Pham Van Dong, the premier of North Vietnam, was reported as saying, the Americans won't come back now even if we offered them candy.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it.
While Congress undermined any remaining commitment to help South Vietnam, the Nixon administration was mired in the revelations of Watergate.
I also told him that it was important that this cancer be removed immediately because it was growing more deadly every day.
Facing what he viewed as near certain impeachment, Richard Nixon announced his resignation.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Whatever obligation American leadership felt to its South Vietnamese allies seemingly disappeared with the end of the Nixon administration. Vice President Gerald Ford took over the Oval Office. In January of 1975, now President Ford publicly ruled out any future military intervention in Vietnam. But even then, the future of South Vietnam was not sealed.
And so the Soviets and Chinese, they were at this point not especially interested in North Vietnam prevailing. There had been this falling out between the North Vietnamese and the Chinese, and the Soviets didn't want to antagonize the Americans more than they needed to. But North Vietnam did get enough military assistance to do what it needed, and South Vietnam did not. And clearly the United States was not a reliable ally.
The North focused its efforts on preparing for what it believed would be the decisive assault on the South. Now safe from aerial bombardment, they paved over the once rutted and bombed out Ho Chi Minh Trail, creating a highway for the movement of men and material. Alongside the road, they built an oil pipeline to provide fuel to the growing army in the South. In the spring of 1975, with its strength renewed, Hanoi launched what would become known as the Final Offensive.
And Hanoi sent virtually its entire military to conquer its neighbors. They kept the 325th Division back to protect Hanoi against domestic threats, I suspect. But otherwise, they let us have everything. And when those tanks started going down South Vietnamese roads, you cannot hide a tank and a rice paddy. And those tanks would have been sitting ducks for our 87s.
President Ford made a desperate appeal to a joint session of Congress, trying to get some sort of aid for the South.
Fundamental decency requires that we do everything in our power to ease the misery and the pain of the monumental human crisis which has befallen the people of Vietnam. South Vietnam needs urgently an additional $722 million in very specific military supplies from the United States.
Upon hearing Ford's request, several Democratic members walked out on the president. Representative Philip Burton, Democrat of California, called the president's request outrageous. Republican Senator Mark Hatfield said, "I'm appalled that a man would continue in such a bankrupt policy." The North Vietnamese thought the takeover of the South would take 2 years. It took just 55 days.
In the final offensive, the North Vietnamese undertake one attack and take a provincial capital to see what the United States is going to do. And had the United States bombed at that point, it's very unlikely they would have continued. But once they see the Americans aren't doing anything, then that's the green light for them to keep going.
They broke the accords by, mounting a new invasion, which ultimately defeated the South, but it defeated them because we had cut off aid.
Without American air support, the South Vietnamese army was soon overwhelmed. Refugees flooded Highway 7B, a main road to the coast, in what would be called the Convoy of Death. On April 23rd, North Vietnamese troops reached the outskirts of Saigon. On that same day, President Ford announced to a student audience at Tulane University that as far as America was concerned, the war was over.
Today, America can regain the sense of pride that existed before Vietnam. But it cannot be achieved by refighting a war that is finished as far as America is concerned.
One week later, on April 30th, Saigon fell, and the last Americans were evacuated.
After the fall of Saigon, there are a lot of assassinations of South Vietnamese who had supported the United States, especially leaders. The foreign press is kept away, so we never get a very accurate count of it, but it is certainly a large number. We have a somewhat better idea of how many went to the so-called re-education camps, several 100,000 at least. A lot of them end up dying in the re-education camps.
Some opponents of the war reacted with indifference to the North's victory. Former Senator William Fulbright remarked, "I am no more distressed than I would be about Arkansas losing a football game to Texas." For the veterans of Vietnam, the defeat carried special meaning. Unlike previous generations, the men and women who served in Vietnam did not receive a hero's welcome at home.
It was a very shameful episode in our history, not just abandoning our ally, which was very unfortunate and hurt U.S. reputation amongst other countries throughout the world. Also, the treatment of Vietnam veterans was absolutely despicable. There's sort of a revisionist on the left side now. They say, well, no one was spit on, or, that didn't happen. Yes, it did happen. And you can talk to a number of Vietnam veterans who talk very vividly about their experience coming home.
When I got to outprocess at Oakland Army Base, we walked through a tunnel off the tarmac into like a hangar or building or something, and it was an L turn in the middle, and on the wall was a very faded American flag painted and a sign saying, "America is proud of you." That was it. Other than that, they said, "Put your boots over here, do this, fill out your turn in your medical records." And then they said, "Don't wear a uniform into town." Most of us had come back with medals, and we were proud of what we'd done. And they're saying, "Oh no, you go into town, you're probably going to get in a fight or whatever." And then we started hearing stories about people being spit at and so forth.
John Rambo, a drifter.
The portrayal of the Vietnam veteran in popular media
I do not belong in this house, and they're saying that I don't belong over there.
as either a ticking time bomb or a disillusioned drug addict is simply wrong. The proportion of Vietnam veterans who suffer from post-traumatic stress is actually less compared to previous wars. Vietnam veterans have a lower unemployment rate than their civilian counterparts. The rate of divorce and suicide is no higher. And far from being disillusioned by their experience in the war, polls show that Vietnam veterans are strongly patriotic and more likely to support U.S. military intervention compared to those who didn't serve in that conflict.
When American soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen came back from the war, your families were happy to see you by and large, but in terms of general public, in terms of perception in media and in the academic community, you were being blamed for what happened. The average age of soldiers was 19 years old, I'm sorry, but teenagers don't start international wars. We had to deal with it without a whole lot of outside support. especially those who were draftees, were left on their own. Then came the sympathy, which is the other side of contempt, which is, oh, we're going to build you a monument. We're going to give you a parade 15 years after the war ended. Excuse me? I think a lot of us are somewhat indignant because we know who we are and we know the people we served with. And they were good people. But by and large, these are people that would die for each other. They would die for their country, and their hearts were good hearts. My heart always goes out to the families, because I think in many ways, those who loved us felt it even more than we did.
Of course, the war was over for the United States, but it certainly was just beginning in terms of its full horror for the people who were left behind. We saw what happened with the boat people, with the people going to re-education camps being killed. The communist regime was not a government that was going to redistribute land to the peasants. It was not an organic uprising of the people. It was not something that the people wanted.
The fall of Vietnam unleashed communist forces throughout Indochina. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, backed by North Vietnam, forced the population into the countryside. Between 1975 and 1978, as many as 3 million Cambodians died by execution, slave labor, and famine. In Laos, the Pathet Lao hunted down what it called American collaborators, resulting in a genocidal campaign against the minority Hmong, whose villages were bombed and attacked with poison gas. As many as 2.5 million South Vietnamese were sent to more than 300 prison camps throughout the country. In an attempt to integrate the two populations, Hanoi sent more than 1 million North Vietnamese to live in the South, while an equal number of Southerners were relocated to new economic zones in the North, uninhabited areas not suitable for even subsistence agriculture. 2 million fled Vietnam by boat, risking piracy, rape, drowning, and starvation in a desperate attempt to escape communism. If this wasn't the domino theory in action, it was something close.
Of course, South Vietnam did fall to communism, and then Laos fell to communism, Cambodia fell to communism, and then Thailand didn't. So people say, oh, well, the domino theory didn't work because Thailand didn't go communist. But at the same time, in the 1970s, you had Mozambique, you had Angola, you had Yemen, you had Afghanistan, you had Grenada, you had Nicaragua. So there are other dominoes falling after Vietnam that weren't in line like dominoes, but were still part of the same dynamic.
Thank you, Commander Vanderkleef.
In 1980, Ronald Reagan criticized what he described as the Vietnam Syndrome and defended America's role in the war.
Well, it's time that we recognized ours was in truth a noble cause. A small country, newly free from colonial rule, sought our help in establishing self-rule and the means of self-defense against a totalitarian neighbor bent on conquest. We dishonor the memory of 50,000 young Americans who died in that cause when we give way to feelings of guilt, as if we were doing something shameful. And as a result, we've been shabby in our treatment of those who returned.
Reagan went on to win the Cold War and witnessed the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But despite the repudiation of communism in much of the world and the suffering in Vietnam after the American withdrawal, other presidents still worked hard to avoid any comparisons between Vietnam and their own handling of foreign issues. The Vietnam Syndrome continued.
We promised this would not be another Vietnam, and we kept that promise.
The specter of Vietnam has been buried forever in the desert sands of the Arabian Peninsula.
Now I'd be glad to take your questions.
Mr. President, April is turning into the deadliest month in Iraq since the fall of Baghdad, and some people are comparing Iraq to Vietnam and talking about a quagmire. Polls show that support for your policy is declining and that fewer than half Americans now support it. What does that say to you, and how do you answer the Vietnam comparison?
Yeah. I think the analogy is false.
Those who suggest that Afghanistan is another Vietnam, they argue that it cannot be stabilized, and we're better off cutting our losses and rapidly withdrawing. I believe this argument depends on a false reading of history.
My fellow Americans, the war in Afghanistan is now over.
If we look at the war in Afghanistan, this was a 20-year war. You could argue also, to some extent, not fought terribly effectively.
It's time to look to the future, not the past. To a future that's safer, to a future that's more secure.
And so once again, what happened? What happened is an American president, in this case, pulled the plug.
At the height of the Vietnam War, 1/3 of the world's people lived under some form of communism. Today, the Soviet Union itself has been relegated to what Leon Trotsky once called the dustbin of history. The Cold War was won, even if Vietnam itself was lost.
I do think from a moral point of view that Vietnam was justified. We were supporting a non-communist government against a communist regime that was hell-bent on conquest. We were on the right side of this conflict.
Under the United Nations Charter, every nation in the world in the face of an armed attack has the right to defend themselves. That's what we were doing, and we were assisting one of our allies in South Vietnam in doing that.
We were supporting freedom, a free people fighting against a communist regime that was backed by our Cold War adversaries. And it was a noble effort on our part, and it could have been won.
$53,000 Americans gave their lives in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam Memorial, dedicated in 1982, is inscribed with the name of every member of the U.S. Armed Forces who either gave their lives in the war or are still missing. It is the most visited monument in Washington, D.C., a testament to the fact that Vietnam remains an important part of the American story.
I went right from high school into the military. I was wounded 3 times before I was even 19 years old. So I was just thanking God that I was still alive. I couldn't believe at times I felt like a ghost. For many years, I felt like I was on this earth, but somehow I was not really of it. And I think anybody that's been through a war has similar feelings expressed a little bit differently, but you're just wondering if you've been in heavy combat, you know, how did I survive that? And at some point you just make peace with it. That's what happened with me.
I just started my 79th year, and I don't know how much time I've got left, but one of the things I want to spend that time on is helping the American people to understand that we were right to fight in Vietnam, and that the men and women who sacrificed deserve their respect.
Recent events remind us that the world is a dangerous place. Deciding where and how to intervene, whether to use military force or rely on economic leverage, understanding the internal dynamics of allies and adversaries alike. These are all key elements of a successful foreign policy. Vietnam was a military defeat, and as we've seen, the lessons of the war are not simple. But only by critically examining the past can we hope to improve our choices in the future? If you haven't seen my other unauthorized histories, check out the Unauthorized History of Taxes and the Unauthorized History of Socialism, both on Fox Nation. And keep an eye out for more unauthorized histories as we continue to look at America's story in new and different ways. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'm Brett Baer.